Hey everyone, Rose here, and Happy New Year! For the past couple of years, around New Year's-ish, I've gone back through my middle school sketchbook to pick out a dragon to redraw. Just like the last 2 years, I made a poll again to let you guys decide which one I should redraw, and this time the winner was the spiky dragon. So without further ado, let's get into the time-lapse and I'll explain to you a little bit about my design, the ideas, and my painting process. This little fellow here is the Spiklops. It's always been one of the more interesting dragon ideas I had. It deviates a little bit from sort of this normal idea of what a dragon is. It's herbivorous, it lives in herds, it has long legs and can run relatively fast, and it's relatively calm and docile. It's also covered in spikes, kind of like a hedgehog. That being said, the original design was very simple and not really something that I felt like I could translate very well into my current style. It has sort of like the proportions of a horse, at least to the extent I was capable of at the time, and some like slightly odd, almost flying fish-like wings, as opposed to the normal bat wings most of my dragons had. Plus the more mammal-like barb kind of spikes were very hard to translate into my current style of designing dragons. So just like last year, instead of trying to be super loyal to the original design and making a new artwork of it, I decided to take the basic ideas and concepts I had come up with and translate them into a completely new design. In addition to horses, I also referenced bison and rhinos for the shape of the body and the general kind of vibe, since that really felt like it made a lot of sense for some like grass-eating animal that lives and roams in big herds. I also referenced a whole bunch of extinct megafauna, some dinosaurs, especially stegosaurs, and a couple of extinct horse relatives. There are some really wonky looking ones out there. I also gave this dragon a third eye, which isn't something that's in the original design, but I did name it Spiklops back then, so really I had it coming. Funnily enough, there are actually quite a few reptiles that have a third eye, especially a whole bunch of lizards, I think. It's not just like full-on eyeball like you'd recognize, it looks more like a slightly odd scale. But it does help them manage their day-night cycle, their body temperature, and possibly helps them like detect predators flying overhead. I tried out a handful of different designs in the sketches, as you can see here, though really not as many as I probably could have. Overall, throughout the whole process here of this painting, I had a bit of a pattern of like situations where I could have probably tried a few more things or made a few more like iterations on ideas that I have, but I just kind of didn't because I was feeling a bit lazy and distracted. But I think it still turned out pretty okay, so, you know, it is what it is. Not really much of a point trying to force myself to spend more and more time on an artwork where I don't really feel like actually spending the amount of time. One thing in this design that was a particular struggle was the wings. I realized pretty early on that trying to add normal dragon wings just didn't fit to this sort of heavier, like running type build of an animal. So I tried kind of smaller sails almost, but those didn't really work that well either in between the spikes. Like it felt like at any point the spikes would just jostle a little bit and poke right through the membranes of the sails. So eventually I just ended up with these extra big spikes along the sides of the body, almost like a stegosaurus. And sticking with that theme, I also gave it a thagomizer, which is apparently like the semi-unofficial name of this like spike thingy stegosaurs have at the end of their tail. It's a very good name. It came from just like a cartoon. Once I was fairly happy with the design, it was time to like figure out the pose. Once again, this was kind of a situation where I could have probably tried out a few more, but I didn't feel like it, so I really just had this sort of grazing versus running, and I started a few other sketches and then abandoned them. At some point, I considered making a quick 3D mock-up to mess around with the poses and lighting and especially perspective, but I didn't do that. I kind of regret not doing that because honestly I think it would have helped a lot with this painting, but it turned out fine without it, so next time. Either way, at some point I just took one of the first sketches I'd made and scaled it up and sort of used liquify and a couple of the transform tools to adjust it to make it match the perspective I wanted. I also tweaked the pose just a little bit to put it in a slightly different point and a gallop, and just added a bunch of general detail to everything. Since one of the sort of defining features of the Spiklops was that it lives in herds, I decided to add a couple of extra, one way far in the background and one really close in the foreground, to sort of frame the central one and add that feeling of a fast-moving herd. To even more emphasize the almost overwhelming speed and power of the creatures, I made the whole painting at a pretty substantial angle, so the horizon is quite tilted. Once I was happy with how the sketch was looking, I duplicated it, scaled it down, and started trying out colors. I knew I wanted them running across a tundra, but I wasn't sure if I wanted it in summer or in winter, so I tried both variations out, and then I messed around with just some general color schemes. A cloudy sky, a blue sky, more or less snow, just really bright, saturated blues or something more dull. A whole bunch of different things, until I found something I was relatively satisfied with. I also added a layer on top that was completely filled with gray and set to color, which I could occasionally toggle on to check the values of my thumbnails. Usually when something doesn't quite look right or feel a little flat or just doesn't really have a clear focal point or something like that, it's because your values, i.e. your lights and darks, are all too close together, or you don't have contrast in the places that you would want it, or something like that. So it's useful to have a layer like that just to check every once in a while. Eventually, I decided on this very gray, blue, cool scene in the bottom middle with a gray sky and the relatively saturated Spiklops. And I scaled it back up to match the original sketch and separated out the flat color I had made into separate layers for foreground, Spiklops, the focal point itself, the background, the sky, and like everything I felt needed a separate layer got separated onto its own layer. Usually while painting, I'd take a little bit more time to like go through flat colors and then multiply and overlay for lights and shadows and everything. But I had messed around with those just manually a little bit for the thumbnail already, so I just kind of kept what I had and merged down pretty quickly and just started my regular rendering. For this painting, my rendering process was quite like free-flowing. I didn't really go in with too much of a plan, I just sort of went for it. The spikes and scales actually made the rendering process like a bit more difficult than usual for this painting, because I've been trying recently to work more from bigger brushes down to smaller details where they're needed, but I can't really work with my big flat brushes when I have these like small, long, thin spikes all over the back. I have to sort of define those individually, and they need an amount of lighting on them, but also they shouldn't be fully outlined or anything like that. So I had a bit of trouble figuring out how best to manage them and like give them all their solid edges, having them overlap and everything like that. It was a bit weird. Eventually what I decided on was taking the whole creature, the whole Spiklops, and separating it out into separate layers. The head got its own layer, the spikes along the back got several layers, the larger spikes along the sides got a layer each, like one for the left side and one for the right side, and all that kind of stuff, so that way I could work on one set of spikes that was overlapping another set of spikes without them constantly interfering with each other. It was still a bit difficult, but that whole thing made it a bit more manageable, and it also let me use stuff like locking the transparency on layers to add some more lights and shadows once I had defined the shape to begin with. But beyond the slight struggle with the spikes and the extra layers to go with them, the rendering process overall was pretty much the way it always is for me, using the brushes I have linked in the description and just going around the image, selecting colors, adding them to different places, sort of blending and mixing stuff together, occasionally going over to the color wheel to mix in a new color that I find like interesting, sometimes adding extra layers with some like layer effects like multiply or overlay or screen to lighten or darken something, or add some extra bounce light or outline scales a little bit, or really a whole bunch of stuff. As it usually does, this part of the process took up most of the time I spent on this painting. A little bit more because there were obviously 2 additional characters I also had to render, though in this case the background was very, very low in detail, so I didn't have to spend much time on that, which was nice. Starting on the foreground Spiklops, I sort of ran into the consequences of my rushing the sketch, which was sort of realizing that even though I had planned this painting with a relatively dramatic perspective, I never actually defined a vanishing point, so I didn't really sketch any of the creatures, but especially not the one in the foreground, with the proper perspective. So I essentially, instead of rendering the sketch I had made, started over from scratch and took a somewhat unusual approach to the sketch, which was making a fully shaded sort of torso bean and then building the rest of the body from there. It's not something I've done much before, but it worked really well for this one, so I think I'm gonna do that a bit more in the future. Just sort of mess around with my painting process and work with almost painted shapes rather than starting with a sketch and then painting. It's probably not going to be my permanent workflow, but it is a fun thing to mess around with. I did have a bit of trouble with the second one making the face look like the same face, or like the same kind of face, just from a slightly different angle. I ended up making it, I think, a little bit the wrong shape, I'm not sure. I realized while painting it that I really only designed the original face from that one perspective and didn't really have any clue how it looked from other angles. In hindsight, just opening up Blender and making a quick 3D model of these guys would have taken some extra time in the beginning, but I probably would have saved that time later on in the process. Yeah. Don't be lazy while sketching, kids. It's gonna come back to bite you. And with the last couple of tweaks, some cleanup, and a little bit of color correcting, it's done. And here's the result. I'm pretty happy with how it turned out overall. I haven't done a huge amount of painting over the last few weeks and months, and I felt a bit rusty while working on it. Plus, like I mentioned throughout the video, I didn't spend as much time early on as I probably should have. I think this one would have benefited a lot from having a 3D model to get the perspective on the creatures and just the whole landscape a bit more precise. But all things considered, I'm pretty happy with how it turned out in the end, especially with the design too. I think I managed to keep the parts of the original that were like important and defining, while also updating it to my current like ideas and abilities and stuff like that. Last year at the end of the video, I opened up my old sketchbook and read through the old description I had written for the dragon. And that was pretty fun, so I'm doing it again this year. Name, Spiklops. Color, black, white, and ice blue. Strength, ice and water. Size, 1.70 m, length 3 meters, weight 150 kilograms. Wingspan, 2.80 m. Speed, on land 70 kilometers per hour and in air 100 kilometers per hour. Food, grass. About this dragon. They live in herds. The Spiklops are covered in spikes, and a good, kind-hearted, and sometimes strong-headed little dragon. Can stand up on its hind legs to scare off predatory animals like bone jaws. The bone jaws are one of the other dragons from the book that I haven't redrawn yet, but might next year, who knows, depending on what people vote. I'd say the important parts of the description still apply to the new version of the Spiklops. It still eats grass and lives in herds and is covered in spikes and has ice powers. Possibly water, though I don't think water fits as well. In terms of size, the new version is slightly bigger. I'm picturing it about the size of something like a bison, which would be around 2 meters high and 3 meters long, though of course this dragon has a tail which adds say 1.5 meters to the length, maybe 2. And of course the primary difference with this new version is that it doesn't have any wings, so it doesn't have a wingspan or a flight speed. Also, like, the weight was completely off even for the measurements I had back then. I was really bad at estimating how heavy something should be, especially like an animal for a certain size. I'd put the weight for the new version somewhere around maybe like 2.5 tons, metric tons, which is about how much an adult male rhino weighs, which I think fits given the size of this dragon and the scales all along its back. Plus it has like thicker legs, more like a rhino than something like a bison. So I think that checks out. Anyway, that's pretty much been all from me for now. I hope you guys enjoyed the video, and I hope you guys have a happy new year. If you guys enjoyed it, feel free to leave a like and subscribe and all that, and take a look down in the description below for links to all my other stuff, as well as some of the resources I use. With all that being said, I wish you all a nice day, and see you all next time.